Thank you, Peggy and Ben. That was beautiful. Children's Church this hour? Children's Church this hour? I don't see anybody back there for Children's Church. Shut it down. Finding your Bibles, please. John chapter 3, the Gospel of John chapter 3 and verse 22. Happy New Year to everybody. We were away last weekend. My mom likes to gather the whole family down at the Outer Banks over the New Year's weekend, and so we were there for 2 or 3 days. It's good to be back, I think. It's a beautiful day. It was a warm weekend. We got to walk on the beach every day, and so it was very nice. But it's good to be with you. I want to thank Paul Okanewski for sharing with you, preaching here, and sharing his preaching ministry with you while I was away. John chapter 3 and verse 22. There are Bibles around if you don't have one. Let's stand together as we hear the word of God this brand new year among the people of God. After this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salem because water was plentiful, and people were coming and being baptized, for John had not yet been put in prison. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, "Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all the people are going to him." John answered, "A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. He who comes from above is above all. He who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. He who comes from heaven is above all. He bears witness to what he has seen and heard, yet no one receives his testimony. Whoever receives his testimony sets his seal to this, that God is true. For he whom God has sent utters the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. The Father loves the Son and has given all things into his hand. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, and whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. Derek Webb, a talented guitar player, used to sing with a band called Caedmon's Call. Perhaps you've heard it. It was a Christian band. Talented songwriter. In fact, if I remember correctly, he and his wife, Sandra McCracken, was his wife then, did a concert here at our church. He has gone through some hard times. He has gone through some changing times. He once professed to be a Christian, but that's all changed now. Now he professes something else. In fact, recently, he tweeted this, so it's public, it's out there. From the intricacies of evolution to the deep mysteries of coincidence, I have to admit that, we're missing, things keep running to the side on these slides. You have to adjust that next time. I have to admit that I find a godless world endlessly more wondrous and fascinating than the narrative of Christianity. Let me say that again. I have to admit that I find a godless world. You got that phrase? No God. Endlessly more wondrous and fascinating than the narrative of Christianity, the narrative that he used to embrace. He finds something else now much more fascinating. Now, Derek Webb has obviously changed teams. I don't know all the circumstances that have led to him to now espouse this view. I do know this because this is public knowledge. He was unfaithful to his wife, and they went through a very painful divorce. And I also do know this. The author of John's Gospel would take issue with what Derek now embraces. John believes, the one who wrote this gospel I just read to you, John believes that the most wondrous and fascinating figure in all the world is in fact Jesus of Nazareth. And the Gospel of John, this book that we've been in since September, we took a little hiatus around Christmas time for the month of December. Now we're coming back to it this year. This gospel is written to demonstrate that very thing. In fact, it goes further than that. Jesus is not just wondrous and fascinating in this gospel. That doesn't go far enough. According to this gospel, if you read it, Jesus is in a class entirely by himself. He is worthy of our worship. How do you say that about a human being? Yet John does. He is worthy of our worship and our obedience. Now, the key way that John demonstrates this uniqueness and supremacy of Jesus is this. John connects him to the past in this book, but then he takes him beyond the past. He shows how Jesus goes beyond the past. He compares and contrasts Jesus with lots of Jewish institutions and Jewish customs. So he connects him to what God has done back here, but now John is going to tell us all of that is now finding completion in what God is doing now in Jesus. Why does John connect him to Jewish traditions and show how he exceeds all those traditions? Because John is primarily in this gospel writing to a Jewish audience. Why is he primarily writing to a Jewish audience? Because God had revealed himself to Jews in the past, and through the Jews, it was always God's intent to reveal himself to the whole world. But the Jews played a significant role in all of that. John wants us to see in this book that God's relationship with the Jews has now reached a supreme moment in one Jewish man, and through that man to speak to the whole world, to speak to you and me. Most of you sitting out there today are not Jews and do not come from a Jewish background. This man, this one man, would complete and exceed all the Jewish customs and all the Jewish hopes and all the Jewish dreams. And that's how John's going to come about his task in this book. For example, in chapter 2, John, Jesus shows up at a wedding, and he transforms water in 6 Jewish purification jars. The water becomes something greater than water. It becomes something better than water. It becomes wine. The water of Jewish purification rites is now surpassed by the wine of Jesus. And that's what that little episode is all about. Something greater has showed up, connected to the past, connected to water, but now transformed into something better. Also in chapter 2, Jesus cleanses the Jewish temple. And he declares that he himself, get this now, he has the audacity to say that he himself is the new temple. How can that be? The temple was the very dwelling place of God himself. And Jesus says, destroy this temple, speaking of his own body, and I will raise it up in 3 days. How can a human being claim to be the new place where God dwells in his fullness? That's exactly what Jesus claims, according to John. Jesus will outshine and exceed the old temple. Then in chapter 3 of this gospel, Jesus has a conversation with a highly esteemed Jewish scholar. His name is Nicodemus. Nicodemus was the teacher in Israel. Well-known, famous, had all the degrees, was an expert in the Jewish system and the law. The Right Reverend Dr. Nicodemus had it all together. And Jesus in this conversation says to this man, what you have is not enough. Nicodemus, you must be born again. Something new is happening now. And Nicodemus, you've got to get on board with it. You've got to, Nicodemus, expert in the whole system, you've got to be born of water and spirit. Otherwise, you will miss the kingdom of God. Something greater has arrived. Now, continuing in chapter 3, John the Baptizer, a Jewish prophet, is also compared with Jesus. The passage I just read to you. And again, Jesus is shown to be greater. So let's begin like this. We talk about the supremacy of Jesus. That's not what I want. I want this. Jesus is supreme because he is Messiah. He is the Christ. When you read in the Bible Jesus Christ, Christ is not his last name. We lose sight of this because it's become so commonplace. Christ means the anointed one. In the Old Testament, kings and prophets and priests were anointed with oil. And over time, it came to be that the prophets looked forward to the final one who would come, the final anointed one, the great king who would come and deliver his people. And John is claiming Jesus is that one, the Christ. The king the Old Testament longed for. And as such, he surpasses John. Though John be a great prophet, Jesus is greater. Now, John and Jesus are both attracting disciples here in our passage, and they are baptizing them. Look at verses 22 and 23. Verse 22, after this, Jesus and his disciples went into the Judean countryside, and he remained there with them and was baptizing. John also was baptizing at Aenon near Salem because water was plentiful there and people were coming and being baptized. Now, a discussion, or better yet, a dispute arises here among John's disciples and what John is doing in baptizing. Look at verse 25. They're both baptizing, Jesus and John, in different places. Verse 25. Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew, we don't know who that Jew was, over purification. Purification meaning cleansing, probably referring to what John was doing in his baptizing. A dispute arises. This becomes the occasion, this controversy, this becomes the occasion in which John's disciples now are going to claim that Jesus' popularity has exceeded John's. John was on the scene first baptizing. He baptizes Jesus. Jesus comes along, and now his movement is gaining more momentum and growing larger than John's movement. This has all the makings for the green-eyed monster to strike big time. Look at verse 26. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, or teacher, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, that's Jesus, you baptized him, John. Look, he is now baptizing, and all are going to him. His church is bigger than yours. His movement is bigger than yours, John. You baptized him, and now he's taken off, and everybody's going to him to be baptized. That's not right, is it, John? These were John's disciples talking like this. So what's going to be John's response to this? How's John going to respond to this sort of setup to be envious, filled with jealousy? Jesus' group is bigger than my group. Look at John's response. It's remarkable. Verse 27, John answered, a person cannot receive one thing unless what? It is given him from heaven. Unless God allows it, unless God decides it, unless God ordains it. Nobody has anything. God's in charge. He deals the cards. God's the one calling the shots. Keep reading. Verse 28. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride, that's the bridegroom. I'm not the bridegroom. I'm the best man at the wedding. Keep reading. The friend of the bridegroom, That's John. He's putting himself in that place. Who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. John is there to do one thing, to point to the bridegroom. He's not the Christ. There's the Christ. And John's okay with that. Keep reading. Verse 30. He must what? Increase, but I must what? Decrease. Can you imagine that being your life's goal? That's your calling from God. To constantly point to another human being and watch him increase while you decrease, and you're good with that. Can you imagine that being your vocation? Would you be content with that? That'd be a struggle, wouldn't it? John had a unique place in redemptive history. His place was this. His place was to point to and promote another human being. That was his role. He started out big. He baptizes that human being, but that human being is now going to take off, and his movement's going to get larger than John's, and John is to continue to point to him, and point his own disciples. You should start going over there and following that dude. I mean, imagine me as a pastor saying to you, you guys really need to go to another church. You know that? Because God is really at work over there. You need to go there. That's what John's role was. I mean, imagine that. And he's good with that. Let's humanize John a bit here. Because oftentimes I think when we read the Bible, we don't humanize the characters that are here. John and Jesus were cousins. You following me now? They were related. Their mothers were related. We're not told exactly how, but the assumption is that they're cousins. So John and Jesus are cousins, almost the same age. John is about 6 months older than Jesus. They have a lot in common. Now, they had different styles. If you know anything about the Bible, John lived where? Out in the wilderness when he started his ministry. He's eating wild honey and locusts, right? He's got camel's hair cloak and a big leather belt, and no doubt cowboy boots. He's an ascetic. He drinks no grape juice. He drinks no wine. He's a Nazarite, totally set apart to God. Jesus, on the other hand, is not a Nazarite. Jesus is moving from town to town. He's meeting people all the time. He wears a regular robe. He's drinking and feasting. He was accused of being a glutton and a winebibber. Very different from John. But they're both called by God to do their thing. So they're different. But they also have a lot in common. They're both preachers. They're both leaders. They both have followers. Now, here's my point. We tend to be envious of those with whom we have much in common, do we not? Cousins. Can't believe she got that job. That's ridiculous. Don't they realize how smart I am? Co-workers. Siblings. My brother. I'm not talking about my brother. I'm just throwing that out there. Has published 2 big books, and I've published squat. We tend to be jealous of those with whom we have much in common. Competitors who live close by. John, on the human level, would have been very, very tempted to be very, very jealous of his cousin Jesus on the human level. Right? They're contemporaries. And yet, look at John's attitude. Verse 29, the end of the verse. Therefore, the end of verse 29, look at it closely. Therefore, this joy of mine is now what? So John finds joy in what? Accepting his place in God's plan. Jesus has got to increase. I'm going to decrease. He must increase. I must decrease. John is good with that. It's a wonderful attitude. Jesus is not resenting his place. He's not longing for another place. He's getting less and less popular as time goes on, and he's okay with that. Wow. And for us, I would say this morning, for us, joy has the same recipe. For us, joy has the same recipe. All authority has now been given to Jesus. In our passage, he has not yet died and risen again, but he has now for us. He's died, risen again, and exalted to the right hand of God the Father. And the Bible says this over and over. Jesus is enthroned now. He was Messiah when he was here, but now he's enthroned Messiah, and all authority has been given to him. And now listen, Jesus calls the shots for you and me. He's in charge. He decides how you do. He decides whether you rise or fall. Jesus is the one who decides all that goes on now. He is supreme and we are not. He is Messiah and we are not. Are we good with that? How he deals the cards to us, are we good with that? With the gifts he gives you, the resources he gives you, the opportunities he gives you, not the opportunities he gives somebody else, but you. Are you good with that? Our tendency, my tendency, is just constantly compare myself with other people who are kind of like me in some ways, other pastors in the area. Am I good with the role God has given me? Are you good with the role God has given you? Do you find joy in that? Let us find contentment in what Jesus gives to us. This past Thursday night, our couple small group met at our house, and I was facilitating the discussion. And we've been going through the book of Philippians, and here's the passage we looked at this Thursday night. And I'm afraid some of the text's probably going to run off the page again. Yep, a little bit. We got to fix that. We'll get it fixed. Our normal film slide person is not with us. She's been on vacation. Here's what Paul says. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the what? Secret. Because it's not easy to learn this. Of facing plenty and hunger. Lean times, full times. And then in that context, this is that famous verse that all the athletes have tattooed on their arm. Like this had to do with scoring a touchdown or something. Whatever. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So I can do all things has to do with learning to find contentment in the world. You will go through lean times and you will go through full times. Are you okay with that? And in the lean times, are you able to say, I have learned the secret of accepting where I am right now? I'm good with that. Jesus, you're in charge. I'm not. You deal the cards. I don't. You're supreme. I'm not. You're the Christ. I'm not. Because at its heart, sin is trying to be God. That's what got Adam and Eve in trouble, right? They wanted to call the shots. Now, do you know where Paul was when he wrote these words? He wasn't at Hilton Head drinking a little, nice little cool drink out on the beach. Do you know where Paul was when he wrote these words? He was in prison in Rome, under house arrest. In any and every circumstance. What's fascinating is this is part of a thank you letter that Paul writes to the church in Philippi. They had sent money to Paul while he was in prison. Because back then, the state didn't support your needs. You had to have friends who sent you money and food and stuff to take care of you. The state didn't do that. They just put you on trial. So Paul is writing a thank you note for sending him a gift. But he wants them to say, look, I'm not in a desperate situation here. It certainly looks that way, Paul. You're in prison, you nut. Not that I am speaking of being in need. Paul's just going out of his way. Look, I'm trusting God. I'm glad he used you, but I'm not desperate. I'm just resting in what he gives me. Sometimes it's lean and sometimes it's full, and I'm okay with that. That's his point. That's a great point, isn't it? What a great secret to learn. Jesus is supreme because he is Messiah. He calls the shots. Let's keep going. Secondly, Jesus is supreme because he is from above. He is from above. He is not only Messiah, the anointed one, the king, the long-awaited king who was to come. He is directly from God, from his presence in heaven. Now get this. The Old Testament spoke of a Messiah. The Old Testament spoke of a human king who would come and set up God's kingdom on the earth. They were all looking for him. But listen now, there is no hint, as far as I can tell in my reading, there's no hint anywhere that this Messiah would be more than human. That's just not found, because that just was unimaginable. And yet, more than human is exactly what John's gospel is telling us about Jesus. He is human. He's not less than human, but he's more than human. Look at verse 31 here. Verse 31. He who comes from above is what? Above all. He who is of the earth belongs to the earth and speaks in an earthly way. That's John the Baptist. He's from the earth, good guy, great prophet, but this is as far as he can go. He's just a human being. But something different about Jesus, he comes from above. He who comes from heaven is above all. Now, John does not mean here that Jesus was simply sent from God. He's from heaven, God sent him. That's not what John is claiming. I mean, God sent John the Baptist, but John the Baptist is not from heaven. How in the world can this be true of a human being? Someone you're looking at looks just like me, or you, or whatever. A human being, just a normal-looking guy, and you're saying about this guy that he actually, before he was born, somehow he came from heaven? How can that be? This highly offended the Jews in Jesus' day. They could not, well, you can imagine. I mean, we would have done the same thing, I think, reacted like this. The Jews had a major problem with this claim. So the Jews grumbled about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. That's what Jesus says in John 6. They said, is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How does he now say, I have come down from heaven? See, this was the crazy thing to them. Well, what do you mean you came down from heaven? We know your dad and your mom. You came from over there. Came down from heaven, right. John begins this book, this Gospel of John. He begins it in the boldest way he could have. The boldest way. John pulls no punches in the very first verse in this Gospel. He plays the trump card. Let me show you what I mean. Go back to John 1:1. Here's the trump card John plays. That was the most offensive thing he could have said about Jesus. Look at John 1:1. You there? If you've been in church for a while, you probably know this verse. We've read it so much it's lost its scandal to us, though. It's offense. It just doesn't seem crazy to us. Oh, yeah, I know that about Jesus. John 1:1. In the beginning was the what? The Word. This is a term John used to refer to Jesus. Why is he called the Word? Because in the very beginning in Genesis, God creates the whole world through his Word. Jesus was there also with the Father creating the whole world, so he's called his Word. You could actually translate this, in the beginning was God's self-expression. Words express. And Jesus expressed the very self of God himself. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. We're okay with that, maybe. The Word was with God. Jesus, God's self-expression, was with God, God the Father. Keep reading. And the Word was what? What is that all about? So, how can the Word be with God? That sounds like two beings, doesn't it? The Word with God. You with me? How can that be true, and at the same time it also be true, the Word was God? Here's how I think it works. Let's translate it like this. In the beginning was the Word, God's self-expression, and this self-expression, Jesus, before he was born, was with God the Father, and the Word was divine. The Word had the same essence as God the Father. The Word had and has all the qualities of God the Father. The Father and the Son, or the Word, share in the same godness. You follow me? And yet he's a human being. Looks like me, looks like you. This is John's way of saying Jesus is of the same quality of God as God, and yet he's distinct from the Father. This is a staggering claim. How long does it take John to get there in this book? Let me just start out in the boldest way I can. Jesus is God. How about that? There's no greater claim he could make for Jesus. Prophet, okay, good. King, okay, I'm good with that. Messiah, okay, maybe. But God? Look at what this man says about this book, this gospel. John intends that the whole of his gospel shall be read in light of this verse, verse 1, what I just read for you. The deeds and words of Jesus are the deeds and words of God. If this be not true, the book is blasphemous. Because that's what the book is saying. Is there any other religious leader in all the history of the world? Has there ever been another religious leader that actually started a movement that claimed to be God in the flesh? Anybody else? Just claim to be? Nope. Who would dare to claim to be that? Jesus claims to be that and backs it up. Any of you ever watched drag racing? I know you. What the heck does this have to do with John 1? All right, hang with me now. Just hang with me. Anybody here watch drag racing? You just okay. I didn't say NASCAR, I said drag racing. I mean two cars going down the track as fast as they can. You ever watch that? Okay. All right, let me ask you, does anybody here like speed? Okay, now, not the drug, going, movement. I like to watch drag racing whenever I can see it. It's fascinating to me, watch these two vehicles just like, not the funny cars. They're almost as fast, but the actual dragsters I'm talking about. The long things with the little wheels in the front. Top fuel dragsters. Used to be that the dragsters raced 1/4 of a mile. That's 1,320 feet. That's what all drag racing used to be. I didn't know this had changed until I was looking at this past week. The speeds, however, got so high in 1/4 of a mile, and a guy got killed in one of the races. They changed the length of the track in 2008. Now they only race for 1,000 feet. not 1,320 feet, just 1,000 feet. That's a little bit shy of 2/10 of a mile. You got in your mind about what 2/10 of a mile is? That's about from here to over there, if that helps. Do you know how fast dragsters now get in 1,000 feet? 335 miles per hour in 1,000 feet. That's moving, baby. It takes them, let's see, it takes them 3.64 seconds to get 335 miles per hour in a car. We're not talking about a rocket now. 4 wheels on the ground. That translates into this. Maybe this will help you. You go 0, stand still, to 100 miles per hour. Anybody here ever been 100 miles per hour? Ain't nobody. Oh, okay. You got some honest people out there. Good. That's because the police were chasing you, right? That's why you went 100 miles. 0 to 100 miles an hour in 0.8 seconds. Can you imagine that? People are doing that. They're crazy, aren't they? 0.8 seconds. Does that have anything to do with John chapter 1? It's a fascinating factoid, though, isn't it? Share that with your friends. Look at what I learned at church today. No, it does have something to do with it. Here it goes. John begins this book in the very first verse going 335 miles per hour. Boom! Right out of the gate. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's already 335 miles an hour. Boom! This is a shocking book to claim this about a man. That's why John can also say what he says about Jesus in verse 18. Look at verse 18 of chapter 1. And then we're about done here. Look at 1:18. No one has ever seen God, that is, in all of his fullness. There have been some people who've had visions of God in the Bible, but in all of his glory and all of his fullness, nobody's ever seen that. But the only God, or the only Son of God is the idea, this is Jesus, the only Son of God who is now at the Father's side. When he was here, he has what? Made him known. He has made him known. The reason Jesus can make God fully known, help me now, connect some dots, is because Jesus himself is fully God. Exactly. Derek Webb spoke of the narrative of Christianity. He doesn't find very fascinating and wondrous anymore. The narrative of Christianity is Jesus. In fact, you could translate that phrase there, he has made him known, like this: Jesus came to narrate God. And the reason he can narrate God is because he himself is divine. Two years ago this Wednesday, my dad died. Many of you knew my dad. He was a member here. He was 89 years old. Passed away because of pneumonia. When we were gathered around his bed in the hospital right up here at Oberse, once he found out that he was going to die, still able to talk and stuff, he said something very unusual. Maybe I've shared this with you. I can't remember. When we were talking about his death, he said, I want to go see John the Baptist. Now, if you knew my dad, you might understand that. My dad loved outdoor stuff, loved adventure. And in his mind, John the Baptist, you know, this dude that wore this camel hair robe and this big leather belt and lived out in the wilderness by his wits with wild honey and locusts, that fascinated my dad. But I'll bet you this. I'll bet you my dad was most blown away when he saw King Jesus in all of his glory. I bet he flipped out. My dad knows clearly now that Jesus is supreme, greater than John. May we know that also, and may we live that. Jesus is supreme. Let's pray. Lord Christ, speak to our hearts, encourage us, lead us. Help us to find contentment in where you put us and the cards you deal us. In your great name.